Across the world, tiny islands, some no larger than just a rock, have sparked intense territorial disputes between nations. So for today's video, we're going to take a look at 15 islands that are claimed by multiple nations. Let's start with number 15, Migingo Island, claimed by Kenya and Uganda. Migingo Island is one of the most crowded and controversial islands in the world. It's located in the eastern part of Lake Victoria. It covers less than 2,000 square meters, roughly half the size of a soccer field. But despite its minuscule size, the island is packed with hundreds of people, mostly fishermen, who live shoulder to shoulder. It's a place with almost no open space, no running water, and no greenery. Yet it's been at the center of a diplomatic standoff between two countries, Kenya and Uganda. So the dispute, it centers around both the island and the rich fishing waters that surround it. Lake Victoria is one of the world's largest freshwater lakes, and it's a huge resource for the countries that border it. In the 1990s, Kenyan fishermen began using Migingo as a base because it provided easy access to the Nile perch. That's an economically important fish species. As more fishermen arrived, the island's population grew, despite the cramped conditions and lack of infrastructure. By the early 2000s, Ugandan authorities began asserting control. They stationed marine police on the island, started collecting taxes from fishermen, and demanded licenses for fishing in the area. Most of the island's residents were Kenyan nationals who objected to Uganda's presence. Kenya protested diplomatically and insisted that the island lies within its borders. What followed was a slow-moving but tense standoff. In 2009, the countries agreed to conduct a joint survey using colonial-era maps to determine the rightful owner. The results? Well, they suggested that the island lies in Kenyan territory, but Uganda never fully accepted the conclusion, continuing to patrol nearby waters. The heart of the issue isn't the island itself, it's the access to the fish. The waters around Migingo are some of the most productive parts of Lake Victoria. Whoever controls this island can effectively regulate who fishes there, who pays, and who benefits. For the fishermen who live there, daily life means enduring oppressive heat, cramped housing, poor sanitation, and intermittent electricity, all while facing the uncertainty of jurisdictional authority. Interestingly, this high-stakes tension has never escalated into any outright conflict. Instead, it's played out through low-level enforcement, diplomatic posturing, and national pride. In Kenya, Migingo has become a symbol of sovereignty and a talking point for politicians accusing the government of weakness. In Uganda, it's framed as an effort to protect shared resources and enforce responsible fishing. For the people who call Migingo home, it's simply a place to earn a living, even if that living is surrounded by political disputes and foreign flags. Number 14, Diaoyu and Senkaku Islands, claimed by China, Taiwan, and Japan. In the East China Sea, a cluster of 8 uninhabited islands and rocky outcroppings, known as the Diaoyu Islands in China and Taiwan and the Senkaku Islands in Japan, sits at the center of one of the most high-stakes territorial disputes in the world. Despite having no permanent population, little arable land, and few physical resources on the surface, these islands have drawn global attention for decades due to their symbolic significance and suspected underwater oil and gas reserves. The roots of the conflict go back centuries, but the first modern dispute began in earnest in the 20th century. Japan took control of the islands following the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. After World War II, the United States administered the islands as part of the Ryukyu Islands, which include Okinawa, and in 1972 the U.S. transferred control of them to Japan. China and Taiwan both objected, citing earlier records from the Ming and Qing dynasties indicating the islands had historically been part of Chinese territory. However, their formal protest came shortly after the United Nations Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East reported in 1969 that the seabed around the islands might contain rich petroleum deposits. Today, Japan maintains administrative control over the islands and considers them an integral part of its territory. China, however, claims that the islands were illegally seized and should have been returned following Japan's defeat in World War II. This dispute has become deeply emotional and a political issue in all 3 territories. Tensions escalated dramatically in the 2010s. In 2012, the Japanese government purchased several of the islands from a private Japanese owner, prompting widespread protests in China and a diplomatic crises. China responded by increasing its Coast Guard presence in the surrounding water and by sending surveillance ships and aircraft into the area. Japan, in turn, began patrolling more aggressively. The result has been frequent close encounters between naval vessels and aircraft from both countries, encounters that carry the constant risk of escalation. Now, despite the small size and the lack of population on these islands, they're of strategic importance. They're located in key shipping lanes, and control over them affects access to exclusive economic zones extending 200 nautical miles. These zones include valuable fishing grounds and potential underwater oil and gas resources. In Japan, defending the islands is framed as protecting the nation's sovereignty. In China, asserting rights over the Diaoyu Islands is portrayed as correcting historical injustices. Taiwan, while less aggressive in asserting its claims, has sent fishing fleets and Coast Guard ships into the area as well. The situation is then further complicated by the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which obligates the United States to defend Japan if the islands come under attack. Washington has repeatedly affirmed that the treaty applies to the Senkaku Islands, a position that China strongly opposes. Unlike other island disputes, this one plays out in the world's second most powerful economic region, and it involves the world's largest and third largest economies. That makes the risk of conflict, even accidental, far more consequential. A miscalculation in these waters could quickly spiral into a regional or even a global crisis. Number 13. Dokdo, Takeshima, claimed by South Korea and Japan. In the Sea of Japan, known as the East Sea in Korea, two rocky islets jut out from the waves, isolated and windswept. They are known as Dokdo in South Korea and Takeshima in Japan, and despite their small size and lack of any major economic resources, they're among the most symbolically charged disputed territories in East Asia. While the islets themselves are little more than volcanic rocks with some seabird colonies and a few man-made structures, their significance lies in the long and bitter history between the two countries that claim them. South Korea currently controls the islets and has maintained a continuous presence there since 1954. The Korean government has also built a small police outpost, a helicopter pad, and an observation equipment. Two Korean citizens also live on there as permanent residents, largely symbolic occupants meant to reinforce their claim. The South Korean Coast Guard patrols the surrounding waters and access to the islets regulated by the Korean government. In practice, they function as a South Korean territory, but Japan has never recognized the status of it and continues to insist that the islets are part of its Shimane prefecture. The historical basis for this dispute is contested. Japan claims that it incorporated Takeshima in 1905, shortly before annexing the entire Korean peninsula. South Korea argues that this act was illegal and that Dokdo has been part of Korean territory since at least the 6th century, long before any Japanese incorporation. Korea also claims that maps and historical records, both Western and Asian, show the islets as part of its domain. The two sides cite different interpretations of treaties and maps from the post-World War II era, particularly the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951, which ended Japan's colonial empire but didn't specifically mention Dokdo. For South Korea, Dokdo has become a symbol of resistance against Japanese colonial rule. Public sentiment is overwhelmingly in favor of the Korean claim, and the issue features prominently in textbooks, medias, and political speeches. Any Japanese statement or action related to Takeshima often leads to a swift condemnation from Seoul and public protests. Korean athletes, musicians, and celebrities have all also made symbolic gestures relating to Dokdo, reinforcing its place in the national consciousness. In Japan, the government maintains a quieter but firm position. It continues to list Takeshima as Japanese territory in official documents and education materials. Japan also argues that Korea's occupation is illegal and unilateral, asserting that the dispute should be resolved through international legal mechanisms, an option South Korea has consistently rejected. Well, despite the lack of major natural resources on the islets themselves, the surrounding waters do hold rich fishing grounds and possible gas hydrate deposits. But even if the economic value was minimal, the dispute would likely remain unresolved due to the historical baggage it carries. For both nations, the islets are more than a territorial issue. They're a litmus test for sovereignty, historical justice, and national pride. Number 12. Tromelin Island, claimed by France and Mauritius. Tromelin Island is a small, flat strip of land in the Indian Ocean, about 430 kilometers east of Madagascar and over 500 kilometers north of Reunion Island. It covers just 1 square kilometer and it has no permanent population. On the surface, it appears to be little more than a wind-blown sandbar. Yet, despite its unassuming appearance, Tromelin is the subject of a long-standing territorial dispute between France, which administers the island, and Mauritius, which claims historical ownership. The island has a history deeply connected to the colonial era and the transatlantic slave trade. In 1761, a French ship named Utile, carrying illegal slaves from Madagascar to Mauritius, then called Isle de France, ran aground on the island. The French crew left the island shortly afterwards, promising to return for the 60 surviving Malagasy slaves. They never did. For 15 years, the survivors lived in complete isolation, eventually building shelters from coral and salvaged wood. When a French rescue vessel finally arrived in 1776, only 7 women and an 8-month-old baby had survived. This tragic episode is at the heart of the island's historical narrative, and it's been studied extensively by French archaeologists. France maintains sovereignty on it through its overseas territory of the French Southern and Antarctic lands, or TAF. A French meteorological station has operated there since the 1950s, and the island is occasionally used for scientific missions. Mauritius, however, strongly disputes France's sovereignty. It argues that the island was historically administratively linked to Mauritius during colonial rule, and that when Mauritius gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1968, the island should have been returned as part of the decolonization process. The Mauritian government has cited United Nations resolutions on decolonization and maritime rights to support its claim. Although Mauritius doesn't control the island physically, it has consistently pursued diplomatic avenues to assert the claim. In an effort to diffuse tensions, the two countries agreed in 2010 to co-manage Tromelin jointly. The plan was to create a framework for scientific cooperation, environmental protection, and maritime management. However, this co-management treaty has never been ratified by the French Parliament, due in part to domestic opposition from political groups in France who view it as a threat to French territorial integrity. The Tromelin dispute is notable for its relative civility. There's no armed forces stationed on the island, and both countries have refrained from taking unilateral aggressive actions. Nevertheless, the disagreement touches on larger issues like post-colonial sovereignty, maritime resources, and national pride. Control over the island means access to an exclusive economic zone that covers nearly 280,000 square kilometers, an important consideration in a region with growing geopolitical interest from global powers. Both France and Mauritius have expressed commitment to protecting the island's fragile ecosystem too, even as they disagree about who owns it. Number 11. Snake Island, claimed by Ukraine and Romania, formerly. Snake Island, or Zimny Island, is a tiny little landmass in the Black Sea, with a footprint of about 0.17 square kilometers. It's little more than a rock. But it's loomed large in recent years, especially after it became a symbol of resistance during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, before its rise to global attention, Snake Island was at the center of a quieter but important territorial dispute between Ukraine and Romania, centered not on the island itself, but on the waters surrounding it. The island sits about 35 kilometers east of the Danube Delta and holds a strategic importance due to its location in resource-rich waters. Ukraine inherited control of the island from the Soviet Union after its dissolution in 1991, but Romania challenged this control at the International Court of Justice, arguing that the island should not generate a full maritime zone. At the heart of the case was a legal question. Is Snake Island a true island capable of generating territorial seas and economic zones, or is it simply a rock that can't support human habitation? According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, islands that cannot sustain human life or economic activity do not merit extended maritime claims. Ukraine, in a bid to bolster its argument, constructed buildings on Snake Island, including housing and a helicopter landing pad, and stationed a small military contingent there. In 2009, the ICJ issued a landmark ruling. It granted Romania nearly 80% of the disputed maritime area, that's about 9,700 square kilometers, effectively limiting the maritime rights generated by Snake Island. While the ruling affirmed Ukraine's sovereignty over the landmass itself, it held that Snake Island did not justify an economic zone. The decision was seen as a diplomatic success for Romania and a blow to Ukraine's resource claims. For now, Snake Island remains under Ukrainian control, fortified and closely monitored. Number 10. The Paracel Islands, claimed by China, Vietnam, and Taiwan. The Paracel Islands are a remote group of over 30 small islands, reefs, and sandbars in the South China Sea, and a good battlefield map. Though they're uninhabited by civilians, they sit at the center of a sensitive and unresolved territorial dispute involving China, Vietnam, and Taiwan. These are strategically located islands near major shipping lanes and fishing zones, and they're believed to lie on top potential oil and gas reserves. Currently, China controls the entire Paracel archipelago and has done so since 1974. That year, Chinese forces clashed with the South Vietnamese Navy in what is now known as the Battle of the Paracel Islands, resulting in the expulsion of Vietnamese troops from the area. Since then, China's established a strong military presence on several of the islands, building airstrips, harbors, radar stations, and even deploying surface-to-air missiles. Vietnam, however, has never renounced its claim. It asserts that it's exercised sovereignty over the Paracels since the 17th century, and that both South Vietnam and North Vietnam consider them Vietnamese territory before reunification. From China's perspective, the Paracel Islands are an integral part of their national territory. Chinese officials frequently reference maps and maritime records going back centuries. Its claims are also reinforced by the controversial Nine-Dash Line, a boundary China uses to assert sovereignty over much of the South China Sea, including waters that overlap with Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. Now, the Paracels aren't just about control of the land, they're about controlling the water and air. The surrounding economic zones are filled with fishing fleets and, potentially, untapped hydrocarbon. Moreover, the island's strategic location makes them a key node in their regional security. From air bases in the Paracels, China can project force across the South China Sea and monitor military and commercial traffic. Unlike some other disputed islands, the Paracels are heavily militarized and off-limit to civilians. Tensions occasionally flare when Chinese Coast Guard vessels confront Vietnamese fishing boats or when surveillance aircraft from external powers fly near the region. The United States, which doesn't claim any part of the South China Sea, conducts freedom of navigation operations near the Paracels to challenge China's assertions and uphold international maritime law. Each of these actions risks triggering a diplomatic fallout or even a military confrontation. Number 9. Baengnyeong Island, claimed by North Korea and South Korea. Baengnyeong Island is one of the westernmost islands under South Korean control. It lies just 16 kilometers from North Korea's coastline. Unlike many disputed islands that are uninhabited, this one has a civilian population of over 4,000 people and a significant military presence. Though firmly administered by South Korea today, its location near the northern limit line, the disputed maritime boundary between the two Koreas, has made it a persistent flashpoint. During the Korean War, the island was controlled by South Korea and United Nations forces, and it remained under South Korean jurisdiction following the Armistice Agreement. However, North Korea has never officially recognized the NLL, which was unilaterally drawn by the United Nations Command in 1953. Pyongyang considers the line to be an illegitimate boundary and has periodically declared that islands like this one should belong to the North. The South, in contrast, considers the line the de facto maritime border and views North Korean claims as threats. The island's strategic importance stems from both its proximity to North Korea and its role in monitoring North Korean military. It's equipped with South Korean military radar installations, observation posts, and defensive positions. From the island, South Korean forces can monitor North Korean coastal movements and even detect air and sea activity. Despite the military presence, though, it maintains a unique civilian identity. The island is home to fishing communities, religious sites, and even some tourism ventures. In 2010, the island was placed on high alert after North Korea shelled a nearby island, killing South Korean civilians and soldiers. While Baengnyeong was not directly hit, the attack underscored the vulnerability of the entire region. The island does also play a role in humanitarian and defection issues. Its location makes it a landing point for North Korean defectors and broadcasting hub for South Korean messages sent across the border. Balloon drops, loudspeaker broadcasts, and other psychological operations have been conducted from or near the island, further straining the inter-Korean relations. It's not an active war zone, but it exists in a constant state of readiness. An island living under a shadow of conflict. With no formal peace treaty between North and South, the status of this island is unlikely to change. Number 8. Aegean Islets, claimed by Greece and Turkey. The Aegean Sea, located between Greece and Turkey, is home to over 3,000 islands, islets, and rocks, and not all of them are clearly assigned in official treaties. This kind of ambiguity has led to long-running complex territorial disputes between Greece and Turkey, particularly over uninhabited islets, whose status wasn't explicitly detailed in the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne or the 1947 Treaty of Paris. These small pieces of land scattered among strategic sea lanes and airspace have become a serious source of friction between two NATO allies. One of the most famous flashpoints is Emia, a tiny pair of uninhabited islets. The crisis erupted in 1996 when a Turkish cargo ship ran aground on one of the islets. Greece sent naval personnel to raise its flag and assert sovereignty, prompting Turkey to do the same. The situation escalated, with both countries deploying warships and helicopters. Tensions came dangerously close to triggering an armed conflict, and it was only through the mediation of the United States that a shooting war was averted. Turkey argues that any territory not specifically assigned to Greece remains open to interpretation and potentially subject to Turkish sovereignty. Greece maintains that the treaties granted sovereignty over all islands and islets within certain zones, unless otherwise specified. That ambiguity has resulted in dozens of contested locations across the Aegean Sea. Turkish jets do regularly fly near or over these islets, prompting Greek fighter jets to scramble in response. These encounters are dangerous not only due to the proximity of the aircraft, but because the pilots on both sides are operating under orders that treat the other's actions as hostile. The dispute is further complicated by Turkey's long-standing non-recognition of Greek sovereignty over certain rocks and islets, which it views as an unresolved matter rather than settled law. Though the islets themselves are often barren and uninhabited, they carry strategic value due to their location and impact on maritime boundaries. Control over even the smallest rock can affect economic zones, fishing rights and air defenses, and potential energy exploration areas in the Aegean. Both countries are exporting offshore gas deposits in adjacent regions, making maritime boundaries even more sensitive. Efforts to resolve the dispute have seen some movement, particularly in the form of exploratory talks and confidence-building measures between Athens and Ankara. However, nationalist sentiment, military posturing, and the broader deterioration in Greek-Turkish relations have repeatedly stalled diplomatic progress. This issue is often used by political leaders in both countries to rally domestic support, particularly during election seasons. Moving on to number 7, the Spratly Islands, claimed by China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei. The Spratly Islands aren't a single island, but rather a huge collection of over 100 small islands, reefs, and shoals, and they're scattered across the South China Sea. What makes them unique and volatile is the extraordinary number of competing claims. China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei all claim part or all of the Spratly Islands. Some claims overlap, others are based on historical maps, continental shelves, or geographic proximity. The result is a complex and high-stake geopolitical puzzle involving one of the most important maritime regions on the planet. The island's location places them at the center of Asia's maritime commerce. An estimated 1/3 of global shipping passes through the surrounding water, giving them immense strategic importance beyond just the resources. Historically, many countries have cited maps or ancient navigation records to justify their claims. China asserts the broadest claim, marked by its infamous 9-dash line that covers most of the South China Sea, including all of the Spratlys. Vietnam argues that it has historical records of control dating back to the 17th century, and the Philippines point to proximity and the fact that parts of the Spratly chain lie within its 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Malaysia and Brunei base their claims on similar economic zone principles. Taiwan, although often politically separate from China, mirrors Beijing's claims due to a shared historical basis. Now, several countries have physically occupied and fortified portions of the archipelago here. China has been the most aggressive, creating artificial islands by dredging coral reefs and reconstructing military bases, airstrips, missile installations, and radar facilities. These actions have drawn widespread criticism and heightened tensions with other claimants and with the United States, which conducts regular freedom of navigation operations to challenge the Chinese claims. Vietnam occupies several Spratly features and has reinforced them with runways and structures. The Philippines control 9 features, including Titu Island, the second largest naturally occurring island in the chain. Malaysia has established a small presence on Swallow Reef, where it's even constructed a resort and a dive center, in addition to military installations. Taiwan controls the largest island in the Spratlys, Ituaba, or Taiping Island, and maintains a small Coast Guard unit there. The legal situation is just as tangled. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines in a case against China. The court found that China's expansive 9-dash line had no legal basis under international law, and it also concluded that none of the features in the Spratlys qualified as true islands capable of generating any economic zones. China rejected the ruling entirely and has continued to expand its presence. Diplomatic efforts, too, to resolve the situation have largely stalled. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations has worked with China on a proposed code of conduct for the South China Sea, but little progress has been made. Number 6. Rokasho Island Group, Suyan Rock, claimed by China and South Korea. Hey, look at that, it's China again. While not as well known as other island disputes, the Rokasho Island Group, particularly Suyan Rock, also called Socotra Rock by South Korea, is a site of ongoing tension between China and South Korea, despite the fact that it's submerged beneath the sea at high tide. This makes this dispute unique. Neither country can legally claim sovereignty over it under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, but both have strategic and symbolic interests that have kept the issue alive. Suyan Rock is located in the East China Sea, about 150 kilometers southwest of South Korea's Jeju Island and about 250 kilometers from China's eastern coast. It is a submerged reef, meaning that it's below water at high tide and therefore cannot be considered territory under international law. Despite this, it lies in overlapping areas of the country's exclusive economic zones, and both nations have sought to assert influence over it in indirect ways. South Korea maintains a fixed maritime structure on the rock called the Ocean Research Station, built in 2003. Though not a permanent residence, the facility is staffed periodically by Korean personnel and serves scientific functions. They argue that the rock lies within its economic zone and continental shelf, and that building research platform does not amount to claiming a territory. However, the presence of a physical structure, complete with a helipad and living quarters, has led China to issue repeated diplomatic protests. China refers to the feature as Suyan Rock, and it argues that it lies within the Chinese economic zones based on China's broader interpretation of its maritime boundaries. Chinese vessels, including government research ships and Coast Guard patrols, have entered the surrounding waters repeatedly, sometimes shadowing or confronting South Korean vessels. Though there have been no direct military confrontations, the dispute has contributed to broader maritime tensions between the two. Adding to this complexity is the legal status under UN rules, which specifically states that submerged features like Suyan Rock cannot be claimed as sovereign territory by any state. However, countries are allowed to construct for economic or scientific purposes in their own economic zones. This dispute shows how even submerged geography can become the basis for diplomatic tension when national interests are involved. It also reflects an increasingly complex landscape of East Asian maritime politics. In 2013, China's declaration of an air defense identification zone over the East China Sea included Suyan Rock, drawing further criticism from Seoul and deepening concerns about escalating regional militarization. Number 5. Perejil Island, claimed by Spain and Morocco. Perejil Island in Spanish and Layla Island in Arabic is an uninhabited rocky island located just 200 meters off the northern coast of Morocco and about 8 kilometers from the Spanish-controlled enclave of Ceuta. Despite its small size, about 15 hectares, and complete lack of infrastructure or permanent population, the island became the center of a serious military standoff in 2002 between Spain and Morocco, two countries with a long and complicated history. The name's island, which means parsley in Spanish, reflects how minor and unassuming it once seemed. For years, the island wasn't actively inhabited or administered by either country, although both claimed sovereignty. Its legal status was ambiguous and was often used as a grazing area by Moroccan shepherds or occasionally visited by Spanish patrols. That changed dramatically on July 11, 2002, when a group of Moroccan soldiers landed on the island and raised their flag. Morocco claimed the deployment was part of a mission to monitor illegal immigration and drug trafficking, both persistent issues in the Strait of Gibraltar. Spain viewed the move as a breach of its sovereignty. In response, it launched Operation Romeo Sierra just 6 days later. Spanish special forces landed on the island by helicopter, quickly overwhelmed the Moroccan troops without a shot being fired, and reasserted Spanish control. The confrontation marked one of the rare instances in modern Europe where a territorial dispute escalated to a military operation. Legally, the status of the island remains unresolved. Spain treats the island as part of its sovereign territory, specifically tied to the city of Ceuta and other small Spanish-held territories on or near the Moroccan coast. Morocco, on the other hand, views all such holdings as remnants of colonialism and considers them part of its national territory. While no further military confrontations have occurred since 2002, the island still stirs nationalist sentiment in both countries. Moroccan media occasionally reference it as a symbol of unfinished business, while Spanish commentators view it as a successful defense of national territory. Spanish naval and air patrols routinely monitor the area, and Moroccan forces do the same from the mainland coast. Even though the island lacks any strategic infrastructure, the symbolic and psychological importance here continues to shape the diplomatic relations between the two. The island shows how even the smallest scraps of land with no people, buildings, or resources can still become geopolitical lightning rods. Number 4. Belén de Bajira, claimed by Colombia and Panama. While most island disputes involve coastlines and oceans, Belén de Bajira is a rare case involving an inland island-like territory, disputed between Colombia and Panama. Located in the northwestern part of Colombia near the Panamanian border, this one's not an island in the traditional sense, but it sits at the center of an overlapping territorial claim and jurisdictional authority that have created a long-standing dispute. The issue traces back to a broader disagreement over the exact delineation of the border between Colombia's Choco and Antioquia departments. Choco is mostly Afro-Colombian and indigenous region with high poverty rates but significant natural resources. Antioquia, by contrast, is one of Colombia's most economically powerful regions and has sought to incorporate the area into its administrative structure, citing historical governance and community ties. Panama entered the dispute because of its broader historical disagreement with Colombia over the Darien Gap. That's a dense roadless jungle area that separates the two countries. When Panama broke away from Colombia in 1903 with support from the United States, the exact border wasn't clearly defined in some areas. Over the years, Panama has occasionally expressed interest in adjusting or clarifying the border lines near the disputed region. The complexity of the dispute deepened in the 1990s and 2000s as the area grew in population and economic importance. Antioquia began providing public services there like schools, healthcare, and roads, strengthening its de facto administration. Meanwhile, Choco officially incorporated the territory into its jurisdictional maps and asserted that Antioquia's governance was illegitimate. The Colombian central government mostly avoided taking a definitive stance for years, leading to confusion and conflicting local allegiances. In 2017, Colombia's National Geographic Institute issued a ruling declaring Belén de Bajira a part of Choco Department based on topographic records. This decision was seen as a win for Choco, but it didn't end the controversy. Antioquia's governor refused to accept the decision, and local residents have expressed divided opinions. Panama's position is more subtle. It hasn't made a direct territorial claim on it, but the Panamanian officials have raised questions about nearby boundary zones. There's also concerns about illegal migration, drug trafficking, and guerrilla movement. The dispute has had real-world consequences. Public investments in the area have stalled at times due to uncertainty over which government agency has authority. Election results have been challenged, land titles have come under dispute, and infrastructure projects have faced delays. Though no violence has broken out over the issue, the long administrative confusion has created challenges and fueled regional tensions. Number 3. Batek Island, Palu Batu Puteh, claimed by Malaysia and Singapore. Batek Island, also known as Palu Batu Puteh in Malaysia and Pedra Branca in Singapore, is a small outcrop located at the eastern entrance of the Straits of Singapore, one of the busiest maritime routes in the world. Though the island itself is no larger than a football field and is devoid of any natural vegetation or population, it's been the focus of a decades-long sovereignty dispute between Malaysia and Singapore. The dispute has its roots, of course, in colonial history. In 1851, the British built Horsburgh Lighthouse on the island to aid in navigation through the straits. At the time, Singapore was a British colony administered separately from the Malay states. For over a century, the island was maintained by Singaporean authorities without much dispute. However, in the 1970s, Malaysia began asserting claim to the island, arguing that it lay within its territorial waters, and that the sovereignty had never been lawfully ceded to the British and by extension to Singapore. Singapore countered that its continuous administration, operation of the lighthouse, and absence of Malaysian protests until the 1970s were evidence of clear sovereignty. The tension increased in the 1980s and 90s, with both nations deploying naval vessels in the surrounding water and engaging in diplomatic sparring. Finally, in 2003, both sides agreed to take the matter to the International Court of Justice for resolution. In 2008, the ICJ delivered its ruling. It awarded sovereignty over Batak Island to Singapore, citing evidence that Singapore had exercised clear authority over the island since the late 19th century. However, the court also ruled that the nearby Middle Rocks, that's a small maritime feature about a half a mile away, belonged to Malaysia, and that the sovereignty of a third feature, South Ledge, would depend on which country controlled the surrounding waters. While both countries accepted the ruling at the time, Malaysia later sought a revision in 2017, citing newly discovered documents from British archives. These included internal correspondence suggesting that British officials in the 1950s may have considered the island to fall under Johor sovereignty. Singapore opposed the request, of course, arguing that the new documents did not alter the legal or historical interpretation of sovereignty. Despite the court ruling and Malaysia's withdrawal, the area remains a point of friction. Each side continues to monitor the area with patrol boats and vessels, although no further military incidents have happened. Batak Island's history is also a reminder of how colonial legacies and ambiguities continue to shape modern borders. Treaties signed over a century ago, unclear maps, and shifting political boundaries have left many such features in legal gray areas. Though the ICJ ruling provides legal clarity, the political emotions surrounding the island have not disappeared. Both nations continue to develop the surrounding area and maintain close surveillance. Number 2. Mayen Island, claimed by Norway and Iceland. Mayen is a remote volcanic island in the Arctic Ocean, located between Greenland and mainland Norway. It's controlled by Norway, but the surrounding zones were once contested by Iceland, particularly during the Cold War-era battles over exclusive economic zones and fisheries. The island is approximately 373 square kilometers in size and is dominated by Beerenberg, the world's northernmost active volcano. There are no permanent civilian settlements, but the island is staffed year-round by a rotating crew of Norwegian personnel. Despite the conditions here in isolation, Mayen has long been a strategic value due to its location along transatlantic flight paths. The dispute between Norway and Iceland centered not on the landmass itself, but on the maritime boundaries between the island and Iceland's northern coastline. In the 1970s and 80s, as countries began to expand their exclusive economic zones to 200 nautical miles under the evolving rules of the law of the sea, overlapping claims began to emerge. Iceland, heavily reliant on fishing, sought to maximize control over the nearby waters and disputed Norway's economic zone claims extending from Jan Mayen. The contested zone became known as the Jan Mayen-Iceland Maritime Boundary Dispute. In 1980, the conflict escalated diplomatically. Iceland, concerned about Norwegian fishing and potential hydrocarbon exploration, issued protests and engaged in negotiations. Norway argued that Jan Mayen's status as a Norwegian territory entitled it to a full economic zone, while Iceland claimed that Jan Mayen, being a remote island with no permanent population or economic life, should not generate maritime zones. To resolve the dispute, both countries agreed to submit the issue to the International Court of Justice. In its 1993 ruling, the ICJ rejected a strict equidistant approach and opted itself for a negotiated compromise. The result was a delimitation agreement signed in 1999, which split the disputed area roughly in favor of Iceland, giving it access to rich fishing zones. The court's reasoning hinged on the island's geographic isolation and lack of any significant economic life, which weighed against granting it a full economic zone in line with larger inhabited territories. Jan Mayen itself was never the subject of a sovereignty dispute, but its influence over strategic waters made it a geopolitical bargaining chip. Today, it remains firmly under Norwegian control, and it serves primarily scientific and monitoring purposes. Number 1. Taiwan. Formosa, claimed by the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China. Taiwan is the most complex and politically charged territorial dispute involving an island anywhere in the world. It is not a small uninhabited rock or a military outpost on a reef. It is a thriving, democratic island of over 23 million people with a robust economy, advanced technology, and independent governance. Yet despite functioning as a fully self-governing entity for over 7 decades, Taiwan is not recognized as a sovereign state by the United Nations, and its sovereignty remains hotly contested, primarily by the People's Republic of China, which claims the island as part of its national territory. The roots of this dispute trace back to the Chinese Civil War. After World War II, Taiwan, then known internationally as Formosa, was handed over from Japanese to Chinese control. At the time, the Republic of China, led by the nationalist Kuomintang Party, governed the mainland. However, in 1949, the Communist Party under Mao Zedong had seized control of the mainland and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The defeated nationalist government fled to Taiwan, taking with it the ROC flag, army, constitution, and many of its institutions. Since then, Taiwan has been governed separately from the mainland, but both sides initially claimed to be the legitimate government of all China. During the Cold War, many Western nations recognized the ROC government in Taiwan as the true government of China. However, the global political consensus shifted after the 1970s. In 1971, the United Nations transferred China's seat, previously held by the ROC, to the PRC. Most countries, including the United States, switched diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing, accepting the One China policy, in which there was only one China, and Taiwan is a part of it. Yet while many countries officially acknowledge the PRC's claim, most also maintain unofficial diplomatic and economic relations with Taiwan, creating a situation of strategic ambiguity. For its part, Taiwan has evolved into a fully democratic society. Its government is elected by popular vote, and its institutions, from the military to the judiciary, are entirely autonomous from those of the PRC. It issues its own passports, maintains an independent currency, the new Taiwan dollar, and it trades under the name Chinese Taipei in international sports and some global organizations due to diplomatic constraints. While earlier Taiwanese leader insisted on their claim to represent all of China, modern Taiwanese political sentiment has shifted significantly. A growing number of citizens, particularly younger generations, now identify solely as Taiwanese rather than Chinese. China, under the rule of the Communist Party, views Taiwan as a breakaway province that must be eventually reunited with the mainland, by force if necessary. This stance is enshrined in Chinese law. Over the past 2 decades, Beijing has employed a combination of economic pressure, military intimidation, and diplomatic isolation to prevent Taiwan from achieving international recognition. It's blocked Taiwanese participation in the World Health Assembly and other international forums, pressured countries to cut diplomatic ties with Taipei, and conducted regular military drills and incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone. The military aspect of the dispute has become more serious in recent years. China has dramatically expanded its Navy, Air Force, and missile capabilities, many of which are specifically designed to prevent U.S. intervention in a Taiwan conflict. In response, Taiwan has invested in asymmetric defense strategies and strengthened ties with unofficial partners, particularly the United States, Japan, and Australia. The Taiwan Relations Act, passed by the U.S. Congress in 1979, obligates the United States to provide Taiwan with defensive arms and maintain the capacity to resist force against the island, though it stops short of guaranteeing direct military intervention. Taiwan is not simply an island claimed by multiple nations. It's an island claimed by one of the world's most powerful authoritarian states, while it currently functions as one of the world's most vibrant democracies.